Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Silver Years. My name is DK, and I'm very happy to be here, and I humbly thank you for joining me. Today is a new segment of my story time. Now, my story time is where I tell my story as a way to counter the ever changing official narrative of history, his story, because no one, not even AI, can tell my life story as a direct reflection of the times in which I lived better than me. And this is where I'm telling it. The story that wants to be told today is coming in from around 1972, 1973, and takes place in Huntington Beach, California, when I was a young teenager. This is about how I met my first husband, how it came about, and how it came together. Because believe it or not, I couldn't stand him when we first met. Am I surprised? In hindsight, hardly. But there is a lot to unpack here, and it'll probably require a part two and most likely even a part three. We shall see. I realize today that it's time to tell this old story as I experienced it and clear up any misunderstandings if they exist for those impacted. It's also time to give closure to these old stories. Closure offers healing. These are things I've rarely spoken about in 50 years and but for whatever the reason, I feel compelled to speak my truth today as I experienced it as best I can, warts and all. And if this helps, I'm glad. But I'm telling my story from my perspective, and it is in no way meant to disparage or attack anyone. This was my experience, period. Sweeping it under the rug with silence serves no purpose anymore except to perpetuate generational trauma. And I can no longer be complicit in that. Take it or leave it, it matters not to me, and it changes nothing. So let's begin the saga of husband number one. I had a lot to learn, and he delivered in spades. The truth was, at the time we met, he liked my best friend, Mama San. I call her Mama San. And she was his target, not me. During this time, he was into motorcycles. He was a motocross racer, actually, and he would hang out in the garage of his friend's house during that summer of 1972 after they both had graduated from high school. This friend of his happened to live several houses down the street from Mama San and was a longtime neighbor of hers, and we all knew him. Little Beta, that's how I'm going to refer to him here, who later became husband number one. Little Beta would toy around with his motorcycle as they hung out, and occasionally he would loudly race it up and down the street while doing wheelies for all to see him. And he would always turn his head to look at Mama San's house when passing to see if she was watching. All this hoping to get her attention. It was pretty obvious she had no interest, but that didn't stop him from showing off. He would even call her house from his friend's phone down the street while we were there. Sometimes when he called, he would get me instead of her because I was known to answer her house phone when I was there, and vice versa. That's just what we did. These were the olden days, way before caller ID or digital phones existed. Our phones were rotary dials and later push button dial. And every time you answered a ringing telephone, you didn't know who or what was on the other end of the line until they spoke. In other words, call screening wasn't an option, and no one had ever heard of answering machines. Anyhow, whenever he would call, I answered the phone, and I would answer the phone. I'd get mean because I didn't like him. I could get mouthy, I admit. And I would say things to him like, "What the F do you want, little beta? Why do you keep calling over here when no one wants to talk to you? Go away." The meaner I got, the more he began directing his attentions to me. Before long, he'd be calling Mama San's house just to get me and my smart mouth. It made him laugh because he got attention, even if it was negative attention. Sort of set the basis for the relationship, all said, but it was attention nonetheless. Go figure. A classic. It was a classic case of falling for the target's best friend because the best friend had zero interest, didn't care, and didn't like him. When little beta, though, with him, it was all an ego thing. He needed to conquer and dominate, win the prize after a good fight. So, with great strategy, he began taking steps to win me over. Or maybe it was more like setting the trap. And let me say that for my age, and I was very young, I was 14 or 15, 14 and 15. And for my age, I had been weighed down most of my life with great responsibility in the house I grew up in. This brought a level of maturity that most of my peers didn't have yet. I was quite strong and emotionally advanced in the ways of caring for others, given my role in caring for my four younger sisters and taking care of the house. But I was extremely naive to the ways of boys or men or anything male in gender. I knew nothing about boys other than the illusion promoted to my generation in the magazines and on television or in the movies. And I had no brothers to learn from in real life. As I mentioned in my storytime piece titled Reminiscing About My Brother, I'll put a link up there if you're interested. My brother was not raised with me and had very little influence on my life overall, other than he tried to molest me once when I was about 10 years old, while my four sisters and I were staying at my grandmother's house. I was petrified and pretended to be asleep as I turned my back to him. My brother didn't know we were siblings at that point, and of course, neither did I. I never spoke of the incident to anyone, ever. This is the first time I've spoken of it. And we never spoke of it between ourselves. It happened once, and it never happened again. Whatever his motivation, it went with him to his grave, and I let it be. My father was not present in the home I grew up in after I turned 12. Prior to that, he never taught me a darn thing about the ways of men. He did, however, work very hard to attempt to convince me that he was the good guy in my world, that he would be there for me. Not that any of his instruction would have helped me attract anything healthy in any way of a male partner ever, because my father was an alcoholic, an addict, drug addict, a pedo molester, and a womanizer. He hated women. He hated his own mother. And he didn't have a loyal bone in his body other than his loyalty to himself, his erection, and his wallet. He was his priority, and he had other uses for his five daughters. And teaching them what a good male partner should look like was definitely not one of them. My mother was having her own crises and life issues during the time little Beta was making his moves as well. It was the perfect storm, actually. My father had cleaned out the bank accounts and left her with nothing but five little girls to raise alone only a couple years earlier. He secretly took all of the money and left her with nothing, nothing, when he decided to move out of the house in order to live with his new prey, the woman who later became our stepmother for many years until she died, actually. My mother was working graveyard shifts at the hospital since she was a nurse to support us, and she was operating on little to no sleep for a long time. Compound that with the fact that my mother and I didn't get along most of my early life, and we were definitely not compatible during this time frame for a myriad of reasons. But it was obvious she was stretched and stressed. And my big mouth and my needs, my teenage needs that were not being met, didn't make it any easier. How my mother was treated by society and what she endured during this time is a story for another day. Suffice to say, she was not present for me either. I was on my own for all intents and purposes and had been for quite a while. By the time little Beta wormed his way into my life, I was worn out being the go to person in the house. I was burned out and wanted relief. I had had no childhood, but I was still a child. And I couldn't see any end in sight to my heavy load. I had no support whatsoever. And the dysfunction within the unit was becoming more than I could handle. And the child in my heart, the child was longing to have a family to love me, to just care about me, a family that I could be a part of. I also was seeking a spiritual connection as well, a spiritual connection to something that was greater than myself. There was that pull too. I know it's hard maybe when you're that age to really think about it, but I knew there was more and I wanted to connect to that. Um, to something that went beyond what I'd been raised with because I found no solace or guidance in the traditions I was raised in. And those will be discussed in another video. Too much here. And around this time too, my mother had found herself a Chinese psychiatrist at the hospital she worked at to be her second husband, and his presence created conflict. He was a younger man, he had no children, and well, she had more than enough, but he had no knowledge or experience when it came to dealing with children and quickly prescribed Ritalin, if you remember that drug, Ritalin, to rein in my youngest sister, sister number 5, who was officially and promptly diagnosed by him as being hyperactive. That was a popular diagnosis in the 70s, kind of like ADHD or bipolar is today. They just throw those diagnoses out there. I was instructed to medicate her daily with this Ritalin, and I refused. I would argue with my mother about it, and I refused to medicate my sister. If she wanted her medicated, she had to do it herself. I would not participate, and I didn't. When the Chinese psychiatrist came onto the dating scene is when my grandmother, Mom Kreck, as we called her, my mother's mother, brought a 72-year-old woman named Mabel into our home to live with us and care for us. Mom Kreck could see we were being neglected and saw the need to bring in a full-time caregiver. I did a lot, but I had and work obligations myself. I couldn't be there all the time. Even if I had given up much of my teenage social life to care for my sisters up to that point. Mabel was a lovely Southern bronze woman who'd been born in the year 1900. She was someone that high-end Beverly Hills families brought into their homes to care for their aging or sick parents until they passed. She was considered a live-in and always given her own private suite in the home while working there to care for their family members. And Mabel was between gigs. How Mom Craig found her, I don't know. Thing is, Mabel didn't get her own suite of rooms in our house. Poor Mabel had to share a bunk bed with my sister, sister number two. Poor Mabel. She took it in stride, though, and we grew to have great affection for her. My sister number two grew very close to her, actually. Mabel depended on me a lot to give her the guidance she needed on how the household operated. I mean, I was her go to person for quite a while. And Mabel did not like the man my mother had brought into the house. Now, I bring Mabel up because Mabel was a person that little Beta used to win me over. He became chummy with Mabel and began showing up at my house to have coffee with her. He didn't live far from me. In fact, he just lived around the corner. And his mother had a strawberry patch in her yard. He learned quickly how much Mabel liked strawberries, and he would bring fresh strawberries from his mother's garden over for her to enjoy while they had coffee and chatted, as he worked to convince her of what a good guy he was. This wouldn't be the first or the last time he convinced those around me that he was the good guy in my world, just like my father. And in truth, little Beta could be friendly and personable and very convincing when he wanted to be. He was believable, and eventually I believed it until I saw the other side. So he'd hang out with Mabel having coffee and strawberries as I was working in the garage doing 3 to 4 loads of laundry every day and ironing the endless stack of button down dress shirts my mother's Chinese psychiatrist needed to wear for his work at the hospital or private clinic. One day, when I was in the garage doing the daily washing and ironing, little Beta was asked by my mother, I think, to fix the gas powered lawnmower so the grass could be cut. He had exceptional mechanical skills. He did. He worked on his own motorcycles and car engines and whatever else. He was, for all intents and purposes, mechanically gifted in a good way. I, of course, knew little to nothing about these things for obvious reasons. How would I? And he taught me a lot over time. And he taught me a hard lesson that day in the garage as he was working on the lawnmower. When he was almost finished with the lawnmower, he called me over from my ironing board and asked me to put my finger on top of the spark plug because he needed to test something out. I didn't even know what a spark plug was. I trusted and followed his instruction. He wound up the engine pull cord and pulled it as hard as he could. The spark plug shot a painful spark and charge through my finger and arm and threw me, literally, across the garage. It terrified me. And he sat there and belly laughed until he cried. He thought that was the funniest prank he ever could have ever pulled. It wasn't until a few years later that I began to really understand the depth of his cruelty. But at the time, in my ignorance, I shrugged it off after getting upset, and then I let it go. It was a sign of things to come, but I was too blinded by my need to be loved by somebody I thought that cared, uh, to know that anything was wrong. Okay, this is where I'm going to end part one. I'll pick up with part two next week, and we'll see where it goes from there. So, in conclusion, and for whatever it's worth, this is my little protest against his story. This is me telling my story my way, for the record. It's my story, and I'm sticking to it. And I would love to hear your stories as well. So please feel free to share your stories in the comments. Until next time, be well, choose love, and thank you. Thank you for listening. Goodbye for now.